room for exhibitions, and I'd like to welcome you to the first seminar here on the Property Investor stage. Just a few housekeeping items to start. Can everyone ensure that their mobile phones are switched off or on silent? And if you have any questions, we will have question and answer following the session, so please wait till the end. Our first speaker for today is Australian Property Investors editor Nicola McDougall, who's classed as one of Australia's top property journalists, having focused solely on the real estate industry for the last 8 years. Joining her today are guests Cam McLellan and Zoran. This session is structured to cut through the confusion and speculation surrounding the Brisbane and Melbourne property markets. Please join me in welcoming Nicola, Cam and Zoran as they discuss why they believe their city rocks as an investment location. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for coming down to the first and the best session at today's Home Buyer and Property Investor show. I'd like to formally, on behalf of API, welcome my two guests who have kindly taken time out of their days to come and speak to me and you all here today. Zoran, who's come all the way from Brisbane, flew down last night, so thank you, Zoran, and he's obviously going to be talking about Brisbane. And we've got the lovely Cam here, who's actually come all the way from Blackburn. So he'll be talking to you about Melbourne today.
Hang on, I've got to point something out, Nick. So Zoran's from Brisbane, guys. Nick is also from Brisbane. So if this debate goes one side, it's a setup, and I'm walking off.
I am originally from New Zealand, though, but we're not talking about New Zealand today. Now, the reason why this session came about, we were all down at the Sydney Home Buyer Show a few weeks ago, and we did notice that a lot of Sydney-siders were coming up to both myself, or Zoran was down there and Cam was down there as well, and asking about the Brisbane market specifically, and of course as well the Melbourne market. And the reason why they were doing that is, if all of you in the audience have probably followed the property market, the city market has, performed exceptionally well over the last 12, 18 months, and it's probably a bit hot for most investors out there. If you talk about the property clock, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, if 6 o'clock on the property clock is a market that's on the rise, Brisbane's probably around about 7 or 8. Melbourne's probably about 9 or 10, and Sydney's probably about 5 to midnight on New Year's Eve. So obviously there's a lot of investors out there who are looking at where their next investment location should be, and so we thought we would have a chat today about Brisbane or Melbourne. So Zoran is a very lovely young man from Brisbane who I know very well, and he is here to tell us all about why he invests in Brisbane. So I will pass over to you, and I'll just flip through. The first slide we've got here is some wonderfully looking curly lines which actually show the Brisbane market since June 1998. And look, the Brisbane market has had a lot more ups and downs than most over the last decade. And Zoran, can you tell me why that is?
Yeah, look, it's been a mixed probably time since 2008 and the GFC, post-GFC for the Brisbane market. As you can see in this graph, it shows you the percentage of growth as compared to the national capital cities as an average. And you can see there that Brisbane clearly can outperform other capital cities in years gone by, but since GFC we've seen it be pretty stagnant. So I think it's poising Brisbane to be, go through another property cycle with a good growth phase.
And one thing that you'll notice there in the slides, and I don't know whether I've got a wee pointy thing on this thing or not. Yes, here we go. Whoops, the wrong one. I have to put that back. I was trying to point to 2011, which, as you know, not only did we all sort of go through the GFC, but in Brisbane, of course, we had the floods in 2011 as well as Cyclone Yassi. So the market there, was doubly affected by that time. It was probably just the year before that, the market in Brisbane was kind of improving, and then we got hit with that double whammy of those natural disasters, and so the market has in Brisbane taken a lot longer to recover. Would you say so, Zoran?
Yeah, definitely. I think consumer confidence from interstate investors was definitely dampened by those events. It is a misconception, not all of Brisbane floods, but there are a lot of locations that you can buy flood-free, but again, bad publicity did dampen the market. So.
We've got some numbers here about some of the results that Brisbane's posting at the moment, and as you can see there, it's actually had quite a good result over the last 12 months.
Yeah, the Brisbane market has performed really, really well over the last 12 months. One thing to keep in mind with these statistics is it takes in the Brisbane statistical area, which takes in Logan, Ipswich, Caboolture, those kind of locations. So Brisbane as a local government area, I believe, has outperformed the figures that we've seen here, but in the statistics we've got, it takes in those areas. But you can see the median prices are still really affordable, and yeah, in the next slide we'll go a little bit more into that as well. So this shows here the real value proposition that's opened up in the Brisbane market. As you can see, 2008, 2009, the capital cities were really closely, densely together there in the median prices. But as we've seen this property cycle move forward, we've seen the gap between Brisbane and especially Sydney really expand out to around 66% difference there in median values.
And if we're here in Melbourne here today. If we look at the median house price for Melbourne, it says that it's $620,000 there. Brisbane, $480. So I'm not a mathematician, but you know, probably a difference in around about the 30% mark. Is that right? In the affordability state.
Yeah, exactly. So and as you'll see in the following slides, that affects the property market in several ways. This shows you in a more sort of visual sense how that's affected the market from a geographical point of view. You can see the higher end range, the million and the 750 to a million range there. Sydney and Melbourne, a lot of red and yellow around the CBD area, but Brisbane's still very affordable for people to be able to get closer to the city, closer to cafe precincts, restaurants, infrastructure, the things that people want to be close to. So that's really a positive sign for Brisbane moving forward.
And I guess you know, that juxtaposition is even more pronounced if you look at the difference in the unit graphs there. That, you know, in Brisbane there you can see that the vast majority look around about the $250,000 to $400,000 mark for units, and obviously a lot of investors are looking at units which, you know, in the Brisbane region are much more affordable.
Yeah, you get really good value for money for units in Brisbane, get a lot closer to the CBD and those amenities that everyone wants to be close to.
Now this is a good slide, and I know that Cam might have a little bit of trouble debating the toss in this one. So here we have, and on your seats there as well, you actually have a copy of one of our previous magazines which lists you know, rental yields across the country. Here we have a look at yields for the capital cities, and Brisbane's way out in front.
Yeah, definitely. As we can see, superior capital growth in Sydney and Melbourne has really eroded the yields from a gross yield point of view. So at the moment we see Brisbane in a really good position to be able to secure a property with very good rental yields. Also, bear in mind there's always opportunity to increase rental yields. Rental yields are one of those things that you can directly impact by value adding to your property and undertaking works. So you know, that 4.6% we see there could be improved as well. So.
Right, so what we've got next is if you can just give us, you know, a bit of a mad minute. I actually don't have a timer on me, so it'll be, you know, give or take 60 seconds, might be more, might be less, around about a mad minute. Just give us a quick overview, I suppose a pitch to the audience about why, as investors, they should consider investing in Brisbane, over the next 12 months.
Look, as you can see, my graphs were very statistical there, but realistically, if we just dot point them, relatively high yields, which everyone really wants a decent yield from their property as well. Substantial value proposition, so people can get a good quality property for a relatively good price. Significant government infrastructure, something we didn't really touch on, but Clem 7 airport link, Brisbane airport upgrade with the second runway, busways, you know, the list goes on, and I believe that's really preparing Brisbane to turn from a big country town. A lot of people consider Brisbane to be a big country town, but I think moving forward it's a credible city as far as on the global scale as well. So lifestyle, climate, and also supply and demand. We've got a high population growth which has got a strong demand for our property and a limited supply, so I think that's going to drive prices in those areas as well.
So as a Brisbane buyer's agent, are you actually, you know, taking more calls from interstate investors at this point in time?
Yeah, definitely. I think since the start of this year we've seen a lot of interest, and typically now towards the end of the financial year and the start of the new financial year, people are getting their tax back, their accountants kicked them up the bum and said you should have bought a property by now, start moving. So people are really starting to move forward with the Brisbane market and see the potential that it does have.
Thanks, Zoran. Now we'll move on to Melbourne. Actually, we've got this session's actually in 3 sections. So obviously Zoran has spoken about Brisbane, and now it's Cam's turn to give his pitch on Melbourne. But we do hopefully have the time at the end to actually talk about, the unique challenges that you might face as an interstate investor. So the guys will actually have a chat about that. So Cam, tell me why, if I, as a Brisbane lass, why I should invest in Melbourne.
Yeah, sure, Nick. I understand each of the capital city markets very well. I've got offices in each of the major capital cities, excluding Sydney. The first thing I look for is the economics within a city market. So before we looked at how Brisbane had fared after the GFC, whereas the major economic hubs, Sydney and Melbourne, fared really well after that period of time. So I first look at the economy within a capital city, and that's Melbourne ticks the box there, as opposed to, say, Brisbane, which hinges more off tourism and the mining industries. So variation in flux in pricing. So when it comes down to it, economics is the first tick off.
So we've got here some other boxy looking graphs. One thing that we can notice there, which is kind of interesting, and maybe you can touch on this given you do have a broad knowledge of all the capital city markets, is that they're all positives. It wasn't actually that long ago where a couple of years ago during the GFC there wasn't actually much positive growth in any of the capital cities, but now I see that the combined growth over the last 12 months for capital cities is just over 10%. But even Hobart, which the market there is not doing really very well, the population's declining, they even posted a positive. Can you tell us a little bit more about these results?
Yeah, so when I look at, I use Sydney, so I invest in the 4 major capital city markets, I deem the 4 major capital city markets to be worthy of investment, so Perth and Sydney included. I don't invest in Sydney myself, so I should put a disclaimer there. And the reason for that is I use Sydney as a lead market indicator. So when I look at historical charting, Sydney, because it's the major economics hub within Australia, it moves first, and Melbourne follows it a few years later. If we look at what happened in Sydney over the previous period, Melbourne is now responding, so 9% growth, and look what Sydney has taken it. So it will lift with Sydney, and that's historically what it does. So what smart investors do, they follow Sydney, jump into Melbourne, and Sydney's had some growth, get some equity out of Melbourne, move into the smaller capital city markets. Perth's too hot at the moment. We've got huge land subdivision we're doing over in Perth, but don't invest in Perth. The market's really smoking over there.
Looking at those numbers, if we're sitting here again in 12 months' time, putting you on the spot a little bit, but we can do it off the record, but just in front of all these people, would you predict a number that Melbourne might, possibly achieve in the next 12 months?
I will always bet my firstborn child that property will double in capital cities, well-chosen property, every 7 to 10 years, but I never do short-term price predictions. Nick, I'll tell you where I'm investing, but I won't do percentage increases.
Fair enough. Right, okay, so Melbourne supposedly is one of the world's most livable cities, and certainly today it feels it. The weather's been very kind to us since we've come down from Brisbane, but Cam, why is that?
There's a number of factors. Obviously, culture comes into it. Now, this is a big one. This awards we've won as the world's most livable city should really be renamed as the most livable city in the universe. That's it. This is a big award. So the amount of influx from overseas investors and the focus on Melbourne will continually drive overseas investors. So what we look for increase in our pricing is population growth or overseas investment. And Melbourne ticks the 2 boxes there.
The next one is about infrastructure, and Zoran obviously mentioned a little bit about that too, and there's been some significant infrastructure spend in Queensland and certainly in Brisbane over the last few years, and that is continuing. Why is it so, in your opinion, Melbourne has, a massive infrastructure spend. Why is that important? And can you give me some examples of some of the major sort of infrastructure projects at the moment? Yeah,
infrastructure is really important. Zoran's very right to tick that box when it comes to infrastructure and understanding the budgeted infrastructure in place and what each capital city is capable of as far as infrastructure goes. We've got an office in China, so I study what happens in similar civil infrastructures and obviously a lot in the Asian culture, because our population growth is going to go through a huge change over the coming 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So what we look for, if you look at the cities overseas, the way they developed was they developed in a sense for how far you could travel in horse and cart. So they naturally developed what we now call, we're trying to artificially create, as activity centres. So they've got local hubs where, and think of, England's a really good one. So the people from the north and south, they just don't travel that far because it's got everything they need in those areas. Melbourne has got the most, I suppose, sophisticated infrastructure and the most leveraged infrastructure, so we can develop that infrastructure far easier than any other capital cities, which will allow for much stronger growth through those activity centres like your Dandenongs, Eppings, Footscrays. So allowing population growth to get to and from infrastructure around activity centres allows for much higher density, that's the way our country's going. It's much higher density, so what capital city has got the ability to get good infrastructure will allow population growth.
So with infrastructure in mind, can you disclose sort of any particular areas that you are investing in at the moment?
I can buy a bit in the Northern Corridor, so Greenvale area at this point in time. I live in the eastern suburbs. It's probably a good point, Nick. So I like that Northern Corridor of Melbourne just based on the fact that it's proximity to the city and it's got a huge amount of money being spent on infrastructure going through that corridor, as opposed to the west, which has got a huge amount of land supply and terrible infrastructure. So there's two classic examples of what to look for as far as people being able to get in there and get out of there. So.
Thank you. Now the next one is an interesting one. A recent report has named Melbourne as the number 2 place to invest globally. Can you tell us a little bit more about that report and perhaps disclose some others that might have been on the list?
Yeah, sure. Savills obviously a fairly well-renowned entity that studies where there's reasonable investment over the years. Melbourne was the only capital city, or the only city in Australia that was listed on this list, and it was number 2. Saying that, there was some fairly strange cities on there, wasn't there?
Wasn't Tel Aviv one of them?
I think it was.
Maybe Lebanon?
So you've got to be discerning and always look at the research reports and understand who put them together.
Okay, right. So if you can just summarise in a minute or so, why people should invest in Melbourne, the key points, that they need to look for and things like that, and we can go from there.
Sure. So if you look at the livability of Melbourne, our infrastructure capability for future population growth, I probably do need to disclose something. While I've invested in Melbourne this year, I've probably bought twice the amount of properties in Brisbane this year than I have Melbourne. So I'll go into a bit of fact as to why I've done that. So while we're sitting there debating one capital city over another, the reason I still really like Melbourne, and I've been investing once again in Melbourne, is because of following that Sydney growth cycle. So you've still got some good growth happening in Melbourne. Saying that, I think Brisbane's a better city.
Thank you. So do I.
Just being honest.
Okay, well that leads us on to the next part of the session, which is just about, the unique challenges, I guess, and opportunities that there are about investing outside of your own backyard. And, a lot of people, especially in API, we do a lot of stories with investors who, generally invest in their own suburb or in their own street. Certainly, in their own city or in their own town, because they understand those areas better, they can see them, all those types of things, but that's not necessarily, the best way to build a portfolio. But saying that, it is a little bit scary if you're investing in areas that you don't really understand as well. But what we touched on earlier was that, and Cam and I were talking about this last night, is that the Australia, all of its markets are very unique, and they're generally speaking at different points in the property cycle at any one given point in time. And while there are obviously at the moment some capital city markets that are doing better than others, so for example Sydney, not to say that you wouldn't invest in Sydney, but you need to recognise that you're probably not going to get massive returns over a short period of time. Cam mentioned that Perth probably wouldn't go in Perth either. But there are some, everywhere, the vast majority of capital city markets in Australia at the moment are kind of all on the upturn, which is an unusual place to be, isn't it, Ken?
Yeah, it's a strange time at this point in time. I've never seen, and obviously tracking back in historical charting, I've never seen all of the 4 capital city markets. So it's going to be really interesting what happens over the next sort of 5 years. Smart investors, what you do is you take basically the growth out of a single city market cycle, and as soon as you've had some equity growth, you move that into one of the other capital city markets. So to be able to do that, and that's what I said to Nick when we were putting this together, I thought if we can give a basic practical way that you guys can sort of assess and try and comprehend investing in other capital city markets, because it is a scary thing the first time you go out and you throw some money into a city that you don't know. But if you think about someone's lifetime, so usually people get serious about their investing at about 30, you start to become responsible and go, I've got to do something. So that really only allows you, if you want to get to 50 years old in one capital city market, maybe 2, maybe 3 growth cycles at most. If you invest across multiple capital cities, you can basically chase the perfect wave. You can invest, get some growth, go to the next capital city, get some growth, go to the next capital city. But you've got to have a way to be able to pinpoint when it's at the start of recovery period. And by that, you'll fast track your wealth building. So I put together this process called MAP. And I explained it to people. I think we were talking the other day, there's something like 9.4 million properties in Australia. And imagine, how do you find that one perfect property every time? It's like having this massive bag of jelly beans with 9.4 million jelly beans in it, and you've got to put your hand in and pick out that perfect black one. How do you do it every time? So I developed the process I call MAP, which is market area property. So it's the opposite way that most people pick property. Most people go and get the property first. This way, you can knock out the capital city markets that aren't good for investment, then knock out the areas that aren't worthy within those capital cities, and finally you're left with individual property. And that way you can basically, process of elimination, get down to finding that perfect property. So we can go through some of the key things we've got.
Yeah, sure. So the first one that we've got here is looking at the actual market. Cam, if you could just take us through actually analysing the growth trends in that market.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned before, Nick, about the market cycle clock. Market cycle clocks are great, but how do you guys know what's going to happen next? Really, that's what smart investors do. They predict the future. So how do you do that? By understanding developers' activity. So supply and demand, a lot of people toss around the term, but very few I find understand what supply and demand is. So supply is the amount of developer stock, so developers like myself, dumping stock onto a city market. And demand is population growth. So what we do, Zoran and I, we track population growth in a capital city, but not only in the overall capital city, into the individual areas. So for you guys to be able to track, all right, what happens next? It usually takes me about 3 years to build a high-rise apartment. If I'm doing a broad acre land subdivision, about 2 years. So thinking a growth cycles over sort of 7 to 10 years, developers like myself, when we see there's equilibrium in supply and demand, we go and start acquiring stock really fast. And all the developers do. We jump to the city market, we compete against each other, and we bring stock to the market as fast as we can. During that time, there's usually a 2 or 3 year period where it's a growth cycle, and it gets up to a boom. At the point of a boom in any capital city market is when developers like myself start dumping stock onto the market really fast. We all do it at the same point in time. Hence the bursting bubble. The newspapers love reporting that one. After every strong growth cycle, the 2 or 3 years of strong growth, you will see a price correction come down. And that's because supply is getting loaded onto the market as fast as we can, because we want to get rid of our stock in that market, take our profit and move to another capital city. So the one thing you can take out of markets, how to knock out a couple of capital city markets that have had strong growth. If you've seen a couple of years of strong growth, stay away from those markets. So the old saying, Warren Buffett, be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful, invest counter-cyclical. Yeah?
But that takes, balls, doesn't it?
Yeah, once you've done it a couple of times, it seems logical, I don't know.
Zoran, what would you say about the market sort of in Brisbane, if you were thinking about these key indicators? What would you say about the Brisbane market?
Yeah, I would definitely say that Brisbane's at that point where we've got a lot of interest from interstate investors and developers, and it's at that point where people are starting to consume our available stock in preparation for the next property cycle. And that's why I believe through the next property cycle, people need to be very choosy in the property that they purchase. Not only the particular property style, but the location as well. There are certain pockets of Brisbane that I believe will be oversupplied from developers' stock, similar to what has occurred down here in Melbourne. You could probably go a little bit more into that, the oversupply that had occurred down here. But in Brisbane, I can definitely foresee with my crystal ball that there are some locations that will be oversupplied, and investors need to be very, very cautious of that.
So we move on to the next slide, which is about pinpointing the area that you'd like to invest. Zoran, if you could just continue on in that theme, I guess, if we're talking about owner-occupiers or vacancy rates as two key indicators of, that you look at before you choose the area, can you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, I really like to purchase in owner-occupier dominated areas. It's owner-occupiers who like to add value to their property. They are constantly doing work, whether it's putting a fence in or doing some landscaping, and I believe investors need to leverage against that as well. That's definitely something to be cautious of. I can't bag them too much, but a lot of developers will have investor-style stock and try and pitch that style of property to investors. Traditionally, we find that underperforms, again, because of the oversupply that eventually does occur. When you start seeing incentives, price reductions, kickbacks, rental guarantees, these kind of things, you need to be wary. So when you're looking in areas, a high density of owner-occupiers and low vacancy rates as well. And they kind of tie into each other as well. You've got a low amount of investor-owned properties, a lower amount of rentals on the market, so you've got that supply and demand occurring again as well, where renters have to pay a premium to be able to live in those locations, and they often do.
So we're talking about vacancy rates, and I'm sure most of the people in the audience now would, obviously understand what those are and what the sort of equilibrium points are for vacancy rates. How's the Brisbane market doing at the moment for vacancy rates?
Yeah, I'll be honest, there are certain pockets that are slightly oversupplied with rentals at this time, and I think people do have to be very selective in where they're buying, but if you're buying in good locations, vacancy rates are around that 2%, which is still really ideal for investors. Usually that 2% is change of tenants, 2 or 3 week change of tenants, or maybe someone valuating or renovating and taking that property off the market as well. So statistics, again, aren't always accurate, but around that figure is great.
Cam, there's the second point there, which I must admit, when we were putting together the slides, I looked at that and I thought, what the hell does he mean? So what you actually look for is an oversupply of housing between the area that you're thinking of investing in and the CBD. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. You notice on the list I've got there, I've put amenities down the bottom. Most people talk about amenity and agents selling amenity. Look at the local amenity, it's fantastic. It's got your schools, education, rail transport, some shopping. Amenities on my list, but it's the last on my list. Got to knock off those number first. So the oversupply between the area and the CBD. What I look for there is, if I get a map, whatever area I'm considering, so I like buying in infill areas, so in areas that have got established housing around it, because once the land supply is all taken up, price growth happens, yeah? So I draw a line from the area I'm considering towards the CBD in as straight a fashion as possible, missing water, and I look for huge amounts of land supply, or I talk to local council in areas where there can be high density apartments coming up. What I'm looking for is additional supply that can come to market, which will dampen the price growth of the area I'm looking for. Because most people move about every 7 to 9 years, and everyone wants to move that a bit closer to the CBD. So you're just looking for available stock that can come to market, which will dampen the land supply or the supply within the area considering.
So you'd avoid those areas?
Yeah, well, basically just sum it up and just find out if there's large areas, and do that in most areas around a capital city, and supply and demand is just basic math.
So the next part of the process is actually, once you've worked out that, you've worked out the market, you've worked out the area, the next is to find the actual property,
Yep.
And it's not it can be an exact science, but it takes a lot of research. The first point there is actually buying under the median house price. Can you explain that for me, please?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in buying under the median house price. And the rationale, I need you guys to understand something. Your future net wealth is determined by the bank panel's valuation on your future portfolio. Because investors, we don't live off rental income, we live off equity growth. You only become truly wealthy by doubling your asset value every 7 to 10 years. So, your asset and your equity value is determined by the bank panel valuations. So, a close mate of mine is the director of CBRE valuation, so we're pretty tight. We build houses next door to each other down in Torquay, so you're going to be pretty tight. We build holiday houses next door to each other. So obviously after Christmas, we spend about 6 weeks down there together with our families, and lo and behold, we talk about property occasionally. So I drill in pretty hard about the valuation process. Now, valuers don't gift wrap valuations. This is hard and fast, it's a sausage factory, so they turn them out fairly quickly. If you buy above the median house price in the capital city, the valuer, because they're reasonably lazy, they churn them out pretty quick. They look at a number of things. They try and look for comparable sales in the local area. They look at the median house price for the city. They check RP data and Price Finder and some analytical platforms, and they stick a figure on it. So what we're trying to do is improve the valuation across our portfolio. If I'm buying $700,000 property in a capital city, which a median house price is $500, it's got a tendency to drag my valuation down. I buy property in a capital city about 50 grand under the median house price of that city. Hence, it gives me a better chance of getting a good valuation across my portfolio. Because that's all it's about, creating equity for yourself to live off. And that's what life's about.
Thanks for that. Now, Zoran, if you could actually just take us through the rental yield percentage, and as we saw earlier in the presentation, Brisbane's well out in front for that. But also, if you could talk a little bit about the optimum size and quality of the property that you look for.
Yeah, I definitely see that rental yield percentage is a thing that a lot of investors are very, very cautious of, and cash flow this and positive gear that and all that sort of stuff. But rental yield percentage is something that you can directly influence yourself. So again, buying around or under the median price bracket, but then you want to enhance the performance of that property and potentially add some value and some rental yield to it as well by undertaking renovations. Again, that then translates to optimum size and quality, because the demographics in areas is constantly changing. Properties that were built in 1970, 3-bed, 1-bath, are now, not really examples of what the current market wants. They want 4-bed, 2-bath, they want room for the dog, the pets, all that sort of stuff. So you need to be able to transform that property in your portfolio to suit that changing demographics and keep it at that optimum size and quality to enhance its performance. Again, a well-maintained property will value up very well to banks as well. If it's run down and you don't look after it, that definitely translates to your bank valuations as well.
I think we are over time. Sarah's waving at me furiously in the corner, and I've just been ignoring her. One last piece of advice from each of you, if you could, to the people in the audience today. One piece of investment advice, whether it's about your local market or not, what would it be?
My piece of investment advice would be to create a strategy. Don't just purchase a property for the sake of purchasing a property. Don't be led down the path by sales tactics. Understand what your capabilities are and develop a property strategy around your capabilities and build a portfolio for yourself.
Investing is all about eliminating risk, identifying risk and eliminating it. So follow a process which knocks out the capital city markets that aren't good at that point in time, knocks out the area, and finally the property. So investing is like a business. You follow a process to give you a measured outcome every time. So don't wing it, guys.
It's a good point actually. I was talking to a very well-known property commentator yesterday whose stand might be quite close to the stage, and we were talking about a new section in the magazine which is called My Big Fat Property Mistake, and just talking about how, some experts that we're talking to, we're getting them to go on the record about the really big mistake that they've made and how they learned from it. But they mentioned to me that the only time that they've ever made a big mistake is when they didn't follow their own strategy. When they thought that they were a bit too smart, and they thought, we'll give this a crack, and it ended terribly. So I think that's a good thing, that if you create a strategy that works, then it's probably a good idea to stick to it.
One of the other things that I hear all the time is, I sold that property and what's it worth now? So that's where the buy and seldom sell strategy really works well, and that's basically what we discussed, holding it for property cycles and undertaking works to keep the property current to, again, that optimum size and quality. Again, your ingoing and outgoing costs are very high in real estate, so you want to be able to hold for that long term.
Well, that's about all we've got time for, I'm pretty sure. If you've got any questions, I think we'll have to go back to the API stand, which is just across there. So if you'd like to come and see any of us after this, we'll be happy to take any questions that you have relating to property. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.